All right, so today you're going to be doing the plain seam sample and cross seam sample. So what you're going to be doing, you'll receive a square and you'll be cutting it in half. You'll actually receive 2 squares. Cut them in half by folding and then dragging the scissors through that fold, pulling slightly against the blade. Now when you're using these squares, you have to remember that you want to sew right sides together. So the good sides generally are the brighter side. Take note that today for this sample, I will be using these because you can clearly see which is the good side and which is the wrong side of the fabric. Step number 1 is to thread your machine with different colors, top and bobbin thread. So we'll use black for the top. So you'll pick up your spool pin. I prefer this one. This is another one, but I do like this one here. Great. You thread it around, come through, around the hook, and I'm just going to come on to this side. Now that's your thread take-up lever. You have to make sure you go up and around to get the thread through there. And there's another thread guide. And yet another thread guide to make sure your thread is perpendicular to your needle. And then good luck threading from front to back. It might take a bit. That was good. Now there's a small little slit in your presser foot that you'll have to put the thread through, right through there, and then drag it to the back. Here comes the bobbin. So we're using a different color bobbin. Now with the bobbin, you have it shaped as a number 9. So there it is, number 9, and the thread comes down, and that's the number 9. You thread it into the bobbin case, like so. Hold on to the bobbin. Good, go ahead. And then it goes through the top part. Nice. Lifting the handle up on that bobbin case, you are gonna get it, if I can show, that arm goes all the way to the top, and when I wiggle it, nothing happens, it doesn't come out. Okay, so just to bring the bobbin thread from the bottom to the top, you'll take your hand wheel, always bring that hand wheel toward you once, the needle will go down, it'll come back up, you're pulling on that thread, and it'll actually bring the bobbin thread through. You could take a pair of scissors or something, or see if you could pull that bobbin thread. So now you have 2 threads of different color coming through your machine. So in your sewing machine cover, you have a board, and this will just help just with stability. And it'll clip in, you just gotta push it in nice and tight. Okay, here we go. Perfect. The instruction says, take 2 pieces of fabric, place them right sides together, and line up one long edge so they are even. Then it says to take a few pins perpendicular to where the seam will be. Now, sew your seam with a 1.5 seam allowance or a 5/8. So on the silver plate, you have sewing guidelines, and we're going to keep the raw edge of your fabric to 5/8. Perfect. Driving the hand wheel towards you once, needle position in, presser foot down, raw edge at 5/8. We sew forward a couple times and then back to lock the stitch. Oh, go ahead, tell them.
Oh, sorry. Okay. When you start to sew your seam, I always like to put my needle down near the raw edge, then the presser foot down, and to avoid the fabric or the threads from clumping underneath and getting caught, just hang on to them for a couple of minutes until you do a couple of stitches forward, and then you can let go, no problem. Reverse, a couple stitches, and continue stitching. Remove your pins before you get to them, and sew your seam.
And I like to have my pin cushion placed close so that as your pins are removed, there is your pin cushion ready to go. But you'll get that later when we make our pin cushion. And remember, at the beginning and end of every stitch, to lock it, you must reverse a couple stitches, hold on to it, let it go, and then lifting up that presser foot, pulling it away from you, and clipping your threads on the side. Make sure you clip all of your loose threads, get into that habit, clipping all your loose threads. And then what you'll do is you'll go to the ironing board and you will set your seam by taking the iron and going right over that seam, and then you will open it up and you will open your seams and iron again. 2 different irons. Perfect. Not 2 different irons, but 2 different steps. Now that you have ironed your seam allowances open, flip one edge so you have only one seam allowance, and here's where we're going to practice a zigzag. All right, so we press number 2, and it has to be a smaller zigzag. So now we've got buttons on the machine that you are allowed to go smaller with that stitch length. Good, so 1.5, and actually the other one is perfectly set at 1.5. Place it under, holding on to the threads.
No back stitch required.
No back stitch required on the zigzag. And now the zigzag is often used for people who do not have sergers at home. This is just practice for us. It prevents the seam, or rather the raw edge, from unraveling. So that is your small zigzag. No need to back stitch the zigzag. Press your foot up, pull it away, and clip your threads.
Hit 2 again or
Yeah,
no?
so 2 again for the zigzag. And now you're going to get your other seam allowance. Good, perfect. And then increase the stitch length all the way to the computer says 4 on that one, and then 4 on the other one. Keeping the raw edge of the fabric attached to or close to the edge of the presser foot. Holding onto those threads for a couple of stitches, and here we go, demonstrating you know how to change the machine from a smaller stitch to a larger stitch. There's a large zigzag. Okay, now taking 2 more of your pieces of fabric, good sides together, raw edges even. You will line up those raw edges and you will pin. Again, pins are perpendicular to that raw edge. This time you will change your machine back to the straight stitch. So you could press clear or number 1, and you are going to change the stitch length to a basting stitch length all the way up to number 5. Perhaps it says 4, you could go 4 to 5, it doesn't matter. This is a larger stitch length. Okay, again, 5/8 or also known as 1.5 seam allowance. Drive that needle in, press your foot down, hold on to the threads so they don't get bunched into the bottom of the sewing machine. And you never really look at where the needle is going. You just are always following the raw edge of your fabric on that sewing guideline of 5/8. Nice and slow. Machine stops, pin comes out. Taking your time to get that nice stitch. And at the end, pressing the button, back stitch, and then come forward, release. So now what you do, you have your second seam sample, just like your first. You will set the seam, and then you will, yes, press it open. Keeping your fingers out of the way, pressing that seam open. Good, sometimes you could press this button and it'll give it some nice steam. You will notice with this stitch, that 4, that basting stitch, you can actually pull the fabric apart. This allows for ease of seam ripping when you're just practicing a stitch. When you're practicing if you want the stitch where it should be. Please make sure you always grab your scraps and into the bucket to clean your mess up, and then shut your machine off before you leave the serger. And one other little thing that I'd like all of you to do is to keep that chain so that when the next person comes, the thread and machine is ready to go.
Well, if I hit 1, does it go down? Just let's
Yeah,
see.
it should go down, hit 1.
Oh, maybe I have to do clear and 1. Let's just see.
Yeah, there it is. So pressing the clear is so important, and then it goes back to that regular stitch length. Now we cross our seams. So you've got your 2 pieces of fabric, good sides together always, lining up those seams as best as possible. And your first pin goes right in the middle, making sure your seams will be crossed when you sew them. And the seam allowance will also be 1.5, known as 5/8 on some machines. Hand on the hand wheel, needle down once. Great, hanging on to the tail, forward a couple of times, reverse a couple of times, and removing those pins. All right, we have sewed the seams together. They're lovely and crossed. We will go to the ironing board, iron that seam, and then we're going to serge both of the seam allowances now together.
Oh, just hang on. Okay, so remember when you're serging, always have a chain or a tail to start with, no pins anywhere close, and always have the bulk of your fabric over to the left. If it's to the right, things are going to get cut that shouldn't be cut. So I want to keep the edge of the fabric along the metal of the serger, and we'll serge these two together. And again, leaving a chain for the next guy, and there you have it.
Clipping all of your threads into that little bucket over there. Any other extra scraps? And if you haven't yet, you could go now and iron that seam. So it's nice and flat when I take a look. So if you're doing the crossed seam sample that is advanced, you'll come up to the bin here, the closet, grab a book, open it up to page 33, and in 33 you're going to see a variety of different stitches. If you have a different machine than the one that I'm working on right now, it might be different. We are going to do stitch number 28. So you press clear, and then you press number sign, 28, and we're going to try a fancy stitch on one of the edges. So here we go, placing the raw edge of the fabric along the presser foot. On your paper it says choosing 2 different fancy stitches. I would like you to do one fancy stitch on one seam allowance and serge the other. Just to show how these machines are able to do some decorative designs. For the advanced seam sample, you'll have your decorative stitching on one side, you'll have your serging, and of course your small zigzag and your large zigzag. You will then take it to your serger and serge.
Okay, so when you serge the 2 seams together, make sure you have a chain or a tail, and no pins anywhere close. Remember the bulk of your fabric to the left, otherwise if it's on the right, things will get cut that shouldn't be cut. We want to keep our edge of our fabric right along the metal edge here and serge together.
There's the tail, great. Get into the habit of clipping all of your loose tails off. And you'll see we've got a little bucket near the black sergers that you're able to grab your scraps and tails and chuck. At this point, you could take it to the iron now and press that seam to one side.